French police have just carried out a dramatic raid on the Paris offices of one of the world's most influential tech giants, and Elon Musk is livid. While much of the world slept, armed officers descended on the headquarters of a social media platform that has become a front line in the global fight over free speech. This was no routine regulatory check or cordial meeting with officials. It was a full-blown operation, with authorities seizing documents, questioning staff, and treating the company as if it were a criminal enterprise. The justification for the raid has sent tremors through Silicon Valley and ignited a political firestorm, laying bare an escalating conflict between governments and platforms they increasingly struggle to control. Musk responded without restraint, branding the French government tyrannical and accusing it of launching an assault on free expression. But what makes this moment truly explosive is that the raid was not focused on hate speech or misinformation, the usual public justifications offered by governments. Instead, French authorities were probing something far more unsettling, revealing just how far states may be prepared to go to silence platforms that refuse to submit. What unfolded in Paris is not merely about one company or one nation. It is a warning shot with the potential to reshape the internet itself, and the consequences are already rippling across Europe and beyond. The question now haunting observers is stark and unsettling. If this can happen in France, what's to stop it from happening everywhere else? The operation began in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, before most employees had even arrived, as officers from multiple French agencies arrived armed with a search warrant issued under the country's stringent digital services laws. This was not a brief visit by ordinary police. It was a coordinated crackdown involving cybercrime units, financial investigators, and legal specialists who spent hours sifting through records, confiscating hard drives, and demanding access to internal communications. The staff who were on site were questioned one by one, and the operation unfolded with a level of intensity more commonly associated with organized crime probes or counter-terrorism cases. French officials defended the raid by saying it was part of an investigation into possible breaches of the Digital Services Act, a far-reaching European Union law that makes online platforms legally accountable for unlawful content posted by users. In official explanations, authorities claimed the platform had failed to properly cooperate with earlier requests for information about its content moderation practices, particularly in relation to hate speech, violent extremism, and misinformation. But this is where the narrative takes a sharper turn, and where Musk's claims of authoritarian overreach begin to resonate. The raid was not sparked by a single post or a specific user's activity. Instead, investigators were scrutinizing the platform's entire moderation framework, effectively demanding explanations for why certain material stayed online while other content was removed. They sought access to algorithms, internal decision-making processes, and the guidelines that determine which speech is allowed and which is suppressed. In effect, the French government was not merely enforcing existing regulations, it was pushing to influence the very systems that decide what millions of users can see, share, and say online. This is exactly the scenario Musk and other technology leaders have been warning about for years. When governments acquire the authority to dictate how platforms police speech, they also acquire immense influence over public conversation itself, and France is far from alone in taking this hardline stance. Throughout Europe, regulators have steadily tightened control over social media companies, threatening enormous fines and even criminal liability for executives who fail to meet ever-expanding moderation demands. The Digital Services Act, which has only recently been fully implemented, grants European regulators unprecedented powers to audit platforms, force transparency around algorithms, and levy penalties of up to 6% of a company's worldwide revenue. For the biggest technology firms, that could translate into billions of dollars in penalties for violations that are often loosely defined and open to political interpretation. But the Paris raid marks a step far beyond fines or regulatory warnings. By deploying armed officers into a tech company's headquarters and treating it like a criminal syndicate, France has crossed a threshold that many free speech advocates warn is both dangerous and virtually unheard of in modern democratic societies. Musk's reaction was swift and incendiary. He turned to his own platform to condemn the raid, labeling it an act of tyranny and likening it to the tactics of authoritarian regimes. He argued that the French state was using the banner of combating illegal content as a cover for attacking a platform that has refused to censor speech based on political convenience. Musk emphasized that the platform has in fact been more transparent about its moderation policies than many of its rivals, regularly publishing reports on content removals and cooperating with researchers studying how information circulates online. The real problem, he said, isn't the presence of illegal content, but the platform's unwillingness to suppress enough lawful speech that governments find politically uncomfortable. And the political element of this clash is hard to deny. The platform targeted in the raid has grown increasingly popular with users who feel silenced or sidelined on more aggressively moderated networks. It's a place where journalists post unfiltered footage from war zones, where political dissidents organize against authoritarian rule, and where controversial yet legal views are debated without instant takedowns. That has made it a prime target for governments that favor platforms they can more easily pressure into removing material that challenges official narratives. France, in particular, has taken an assertive stance on content removal. During recent waves of protests and unrest in French cities, officials repeatedly urged platforms to delete videos showing police violence or information used to organize demonstrations. Some companies complied almost immediately, others resisted, arguing the material was newsworthy and amounted to legitimate documentation of events squarely in the public interest. The platform targeted in the raid had been one of the most resistant to the most extreme takedown demands, insisting on assessing each request under its own rules instead of automatically obeying government instructions. That refusal to instantly comply is likely what placed it squarely in the sights of French authorities. The raid delivers an unmistakable warning to every platform operating in France: meet our demands or risk a criminal investigation. And the tech industry has heard that message clearly. Several major companies have already said they are reassessing their moderation policies for Europe, with some openly suggesting they may need to enforce tougher censorship standards for European users specifically to avoid similar raids or legal action. The consequences of what unfolded in Paris stretch far beyond a single operation against one company in one nation. This moment signals a profound change in how democratic governments are redefining their relationship with digital platforms, pointing toward a future where the internet could function very differently depending on which country you log in from. The European Union has been at the forefront of what it calls platform accountability, but what critics increasingly describe as state overreach into online spaces. The Digital Services Act is only one element of a much wider regulatory web that also includes the Digital Markets Act, the General Data Protection Regulation, and a growing patchwork of national laws, all of which pile on additional compliance burdens and expose online companies to expanding legal risk. Even groups that usually push for tougher content moderation on issues like hate speech have cautioned that government raids on technology companies establish a risky precedent that could be exploited by less democratic states down the line. If France can raid a platform for failing to remove enough content, what would stop Hungary, Poland, or any other government from doing the same to services that host criticism of those in power? The operation has also reignited debate over whether Europe's regulatory approach is actually delivering on its stated objectives. The Digital Services Act was designed to promote transparency and accountability in how platforms moderate content, but critics argue it is instead creating an environment where companies simply take down more material to avoid legal exposure without meaningfully improving the quality of online conversation. When platforms are faced with the threat of raids or criminal investigations, they don't carefully weigh each individual post to assess real harm. Instead, they rely on automated systems that remove anything remotely controversial, resulting in widespread overcensorship that sweeps up lawful speech alongside genuinely harmful content. Independent scholars who analyze moderation practices have documented this pattern across multiple platforms. Since the Digital Services Act took effect, several major companies have sharply increased content removal rates in Europe, often taking down posts that would previously have remained online under earlier rules. That suggests the law is succeeding in pressuring platforms to delete more content, but it also raises a deeper question about whether this is actually improving the internet or simply making it more sanitized and less valuable for democratic debate. The timing of the Paris raid adds another layer of significance, coming at a moment when public trust in traditional institutions is eroding and alternative media platforms are playing a growing role in how people interpret events and understand the world. Social media platforms have become the main source of news for millions of people, particularly younger generations who have largely turned away from traditional newspapers and television broadcasts. When governments acquire the ability to dictate what appears on these platforms, they effectively gain unprecedented influence over public opinion. That is why Musk and others are describing the raid as an assault on democracy itself, not merely a routine act of regulatory enforcement. The French government's justification for the operation highlights just how wide the divide has grown between official explanations and the fears raised by free speech advocates. French officials insist they are simply applying laws that were passed through democratic processes and that apply equally to all platforms operating within France. They argue that forcing platforms to remove illegal content is not censorship, but the digital enforcement of existing criminal statutes. From this perspective, a platform that permits hate speech or incitement to violence is no different from a newspaper that prints such material, and both should face legal consequences for breaking the law. The government also emphasizes that the platform under investigation had received multiple warnings and information requests before the raid, portraying the action as a last resort after cooperative efforts failed. Yet this account overlooks several key issues that weaken the government's case. To begin with, much of the disputed content is not clearly illegal by any objective measure. European hate speech laws are widely criticized for being vague and highly subjective, often penalizing expression that would be fully protected in other democratic societies. What qualifies as incitement or hatred can shift dramatically depending on political climate and the personal judgment of regulators. When governments order content removals under such ambiguous laws, they are effectively asking platforms to make political decisions about which speech is acceptable. Second, the sheer volume and speed of these takedown requests make any meaningful review nearly impossible. Platforms are hit with thousands of government demands each week, and European rules often require responses within extremely short deadlines, with penalties looming for delays. This forces companies to choose between careful, case-by-case evaluation and automatic compliance to reduce legal risk. The sensible business choice is clear, and it inevitably results in the removal of speech that should remain protected. The Paris raid has also laid bare the hypocrisy of governments that publicly champion free expression while simultaneously intimidating platforms that host controversial views. France has a long-standing reputation for defending press freedom and regularly criticizes authoritarian states for silencing journalists and restricting information. Yet the same government that denounces censorship abroad is now conducting raids on tech companies for failing to censor enough content at home. This contradiction has not escaped international observers, many of whom view European digital regulation as a form of soft authoritarianism, using legal pressure and bureaucratic enforcement to achieve outcomes that more openly repressive regimes accomplish through direct censorship. The economic stakes in this struggle are just as significant, and they are often ignored in debates that focus solely on abstract principles of free speech.